Various here to talk about this entire story from the inside is former Lieutenant Colonel in the USMC, former JAG officer Gary Barthel. Gary's joined us here before. Gary, thanks so much for taking the time out today on News Radio 600 KOGO. Gary, you with me?
I am with
there
you,
he
Sully.
goes.
How are you?
Good. Thanks so much. My first question is, why do you think that the White House and the Pentagon are delaying taking action right now or announcing any action?
Well, I think given the high visibility of this particular case, they want to make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed with regard to the investigation, and that if they are going to refer charges against Bergdahl, that they've got it right. So I think that's part of the.
I think many of us, though, so for civilians, and you can correct me. For civilians, we're thinking, okay, there's civil due process. And there's criminal due process, but then there's military justice,
right?
And I believe they're different things. In other words, my perception is that military justice moves quicker and swifter and more decisive than our own civil courts and our own criminal courts. Correct?
That's true. I will say, though, that I've had experience with some civilian criminal cases that moved rather quickly, probably faster than a military court-martial would move. But there are processes built into the military justice system that are not necessarily built into the civilian system. So, for example, if Bergdahl were charged with desertion and he was going to go to a general court-martial, he would be entitled to a separate hearing, which is called an Article 32 hearing, to investigate whether or not there's sufficient evidence to go forward on the charges that have been preferred against him.
That would be our version of I heard the military version of almost a grand jury indictment. That's
correct.
What's bothering me here is it based upon what we know, and I understand that we don't know everything. I understand there's mitigating circumstances in every single story, but if you just take the raw footage, so to speak, for lack of a better word, that you've got this prisoner swap for 5 operatives for one, then all of a sudden fellow soldiers come out to the man, to the woman, accusing him of desertion. Then you see this smoking gun email saying, "I'm ashamed to be an American, and the title of U.S. soldier is just a lie of fools." Boy, with all of those things, this it seems to me this is pretty simple. Could there be more to this than we're not seeing?
I think there could be a little bit more to it than what we're seeing. I think, there are different forms of desertion. And so I think one of the things that the Army's considering is, if this was a desertion in time of war, if it was, the maximum punishment Bergdahl could get could be death or some other lawful punishment. The second type is if his desertion was terminated by apprehension, then the maximum he'd be looking at would be 3 years. And if it wasn't terminated by apprehension, then the maximum he'd be looking at would be a 2-year time in confinement.
So what are the next steps? If he's charged with desertion, let's just say, for argument's sake, that the Pentagon comes out tomorrow and says we are charged. U.S. government's charging Bo Bergdahl with desertion. Now, suddenly, President Obama has traded 5 al-Qaeda operatives for 1 deserter. But what happens in the life of Bo Bergdahl at that point? Is his court-martial process like our criminal courts process? I mean, will he face a jury of his peers, so on and so forth?
Yes, he will. So the first step, if the Army were to charge him with desertion tomorrow, the first step is that he would be referred to an Article 32 hearing, which will determine whether or not there's some evidence to go forward on the charges. And at the Article 32 hearing, the investigating officer has the ability to say, hey, there may not be sufficient evidence to go forward on this charge, but can recommend other charges that he could be charged with instead. Once he goes through the Article 32 process, and if a determination is made that some evidence exists that he committed some offense, then the investigating officer will make a recommendation to the command as to what charges the command should go forward on and at what type of court the charges should be disposed of. That could be a general court-martial, which is the most serious type of court, or it could be a special court-martial, which is kind of like a misdemeanor court. The maximum confinement time would be 1 year.
Former Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, former JAG officer Gary Barthel. By the way, you're a renowned expert in military law. You have 20 years experience in the Marine Corps, and you've served both as an enlisted Marine and as an officer. You have a pretty interesting perspective in this particular case here. So I have to ask you this: Did this entire exchange, this 5-for-1 exchange, open up a Pandora's box? You know, the Al Qaeda swap we just heard about, the ISIS Japan swap that's being talked about. I don't recall a time in history where we've talked about doing a prisoner exchange, at least a legal prisoner exchange. Is this something new in your eyes?
It's something new in my eyes, and I think it's going to be an issue with regard to whatever decision the Army makes with regard to how they're going to prosecute, if they prosecute Bergdahl, because I think the issue is going to be whether or not him being swapped out at a prisoner exchange is going to be deemed apprehension, and that may be the determining factor as to how they're going to go forward with the case and how they're going to charge it. And
again, just to clarify, the penalty he could face is if he was. Well, I'll let you say the penalty he could face vary from life imprisonment to just a few years. Is that how it works?
Yeah, well, it could be death, potentially a death sentence if it were deemed to occur in time of war, or it could be a maximum of 2 years if it was terminated by some other way other than apprehension. Last of all,
2 news sources have confirmed that he will be charged with desertion. I'm not sure if that's really the point at this point. The point is, should he, based upon what we know? And I know that's against every bone in your body being a litigator your entire career, but based upon, what is your personal opinion? Should he, based upon what you know and what you've read so far, be charged with desertion?
Well, based on what I've heard and what I know at this particular point in time, I think he meets the elements of desertion. I think the stumbling block is going to be at what level they charge it.
Very good. Appreciate the time always. And again, here, your website, militarylawcenter.com, a great resource for military law. I appreciate it, Gary, and we'll lean on you again as this story unfolds.
Okay. Thanks, Sully.
Talk to you soon. Former Lieutenant Colonel Gary Barthel, former JAG officer, USMC. All right. I can't wait to find out what happens here, because you realize this is a precarious thing for the president. It'd be precarious for anybody in elected office to say, look, we cut a deal. We brought home a hero who turns out not to be a hero. Turns out to be a deserter. And that's not a great legacy. In fact, Vicky just sent me an email. She goes, I think they delayed because Obama probably doesn't want him charged because they would have traded 5 for a deserter. Okay. It's time to talk about, once and for all, e-cigarettes, because California has made this declaration on electronic cigarettes. And the declaration is not going to make either side happy, and I'm going to tell you all about that at 46. I'm Sully. It's News Radio 600 KOGO. Do you know that e-cigarettes were originally a Chinese invention? Yeah. And they first hit the market way back in 2005. I don't even remember them back then. News Radio 600 KOGO. No, I'm not a smoker, and I think we've done a credible job here in our state. Sort of keeping smoking where it should be. I don't look down on smokers. I realize it's a habit, but we certainly have changed our social views about smoking. And what's interesting is, you know, just like anything, you eat too much, you drink too much, you smoke or whatever, until you want to make the change. I don't think that anyone else should be getting in your way for that. I'm just not a big fan of having government say that you can or cannot. Well, California health officials today have finally declared definitively electronic cigarettes as a health threat that should be strictly regulated like tobacco products. And we are now joining other states and other health advocates across the country in pushing it back against what arguably is one of the fastest growing industries, personal choice industries in the country. This is a California Department of Public Health report. It says that e-cigarettes emit cancer-causing chemicals. It says that e-cigarettes get users hooked on nicotine, although there is still more research to be done. There are long-term side effects, according to this report. Now, the other allegation is that new generations of young people are going to become nicotine addicts if the products remain largely unregulated. And according to California Health Officer Ron Chapman, I quote, "Without action, it's likely that California's more than 2 decades of progress to prevent and reduce traditional tobacco will erode as e-cigarettes renormalize smoking behavior." Now, a couple of things. Are we better off, even if you're a smoker or a non-smoker? Okay, because I think you can answer this question openly and honestly. Aren't we better off that smoking sort of exists in its own little areas of the world? Just like when you go to the fair, there's a beer garden, right? I mean, some of these things are better being secularized. Is it true? So how this works, and I've been around them, and very honestly, I haven't smelled. Even when I was right next to it, I couldn't smell it. Didn't know I was next to it. But they heat this liquid nicotine from cartridges in these cool little Star Wars looking devices, because they are pretty cool looking, I have to admit. And this liquid heats up and it turns into inhalable vapor. And the vapor doesn't exist with tar or other chemicals found in traditional cigarettes. And the e-cigarette makers say that using their products, they call it vaping, is far safer than tobacco. So here's the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is that there isn't any scientific evidence that e-cigarettes help smokers successfully quit traditional cigarettes. And the research that is there shows that e-cigarette users are no more likely to quit than a regular smoker. In fact, there was one study shows that 89% of e-cigarette users are still using them 1 year later. So it's not like a device that you go, I'm going to stop smoking cigarettes, I'm going to start smoking this cool Star Wars looking device, and I'm going to be off it completely in a year, because that's just not happening. If you are an e-cigarette user, or if you successfully beat smoking with this, I want to hear from you. 800-600-KOGO. If you have tried and failed, I want to hear from you. If you're an e-cigarette advocate, I want to hear from you. Or if you, like me, are a non-smoker, I never have smoked. Is this something that should be regulated? Because according to the California state health officials, Department of Public Health, you're going to see regulation on no more, are you going to see little kiosks in the mall anymore? You're going to see some severe regulation. Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that impeding free market economies where it doesn't need to be impeded? I'm going to give you the most surprising piece of this report, where unrestriction reigns right now, and they're going to place some real restrictions on them very closely, and it'll affect all of us here. I'm going to tell you about that at 3 o'clock. I'm Sully. It's News Radio 600 KOGO.